called her Moses, not because she preached, but because she moved people through hell and into freedom. Born into chains, hunted like an outlaw, Harriet Tubman walked back into the jaws of slavery again and again, turning swamps into highways, night into cover, and fear into a weapon. Slave catchers feared her name. Enslaved families prayed for it. She carried no badge, no rank, no army, just an iron will, a revolver, and a map written in the stars. This is just not the story of a woman. This is the story of a one woman war against slavery. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Minty Ross around 1820 in Dorchester County, Maryland, on the eastern shore, a region that's defined by swamps, forests, waterways, plantations, and a brutal slave economy that depended on forced agricultural labor. And this was not the deep South plantation built of cotton and sugar. Maryland's system revolved around timber, farming, trapping, and labor intensive field work, which meant enslaved people like Tubman will often move between household labor, field labor, and hired out labor. So, depending on the needs of slaveholders. So, she later adopted the name Harriet after her mother, Harriet Ritt Green, and this renaming is significant because it was not merely sentimental, it was an act of identity reclamation. Because enslaved people were routinely stripped of lineage, history, and naming rights. So by choosing her mother's name, she anchored herself to family continuity, a form of quiet resistance in a system that's designed to erase ancestry. And Tubman was also born into enslavement to Benjamin Ross and Harriet Rick Green, both who were enslaved by the Brodus family. See, her father worked primarily in timber and was considered skilled labor. Her mother worked in domestic and field labor. And this family dynamic is very important because Tubman did not grow up isolated. She grew up in a large enslaved family network with multiple siblings. However, though, this did not protect them. In fact, it made the pain worse because several of her sisters were sold away, which was a common tactic that a lot of slaveholders used to punish families or to settle debts. And Tubman, she watched her family be fractured in real time. And this trauma, it would later directly influence her relentless commitment to returning for her family members through the Underground Railroad. So she grew up knowing two critical realities, which number one, that family bonds meant nothing to slaveholders. And number two, if she ever had freedom, she would not experience it alone. So as a child, Tubman was hired out to other households for labor, which was a practice where the enslavers they rented out enslaved children and adults for money. And this meant that she was often separated from her immediate family even before adolescence. And her early work it included domestic chores such as cleaning, sewing, and childcare, physical labor in the marshlands and the fields, trapping muskrats and icy waters, timber and agricultural work by early adolescence. And by age 12, Tubman was performing full adult field labor. And this is critical because Tubman did not grow into strength later. See, she developed physical endurance, environmental awareness, and survival skills from childhood. So, working in the swamps, the woods, and the fields, it gave her an intimate knowledge of terrain that would later become instrumental in navigating escape routes. So, the environment that was meant to break her body became the environment that she would later use to liberate dozens of people. And around the age of 12, she witnessed an overseer attempting to punish another enslaved person. See, she intervened by placing herself between them. And the overseer hurled a 2 pound iron weight, which was likely from a store counter, which is intended for the other person, and it struck Tubman in the head. And she nearly died from that. And the consequences were lifelong because of this, because the consequences from this was that it was the chronic seizures, severe headaches, narcoleptic episodes, which was sudden sleep, vivid dreams and visions, and periods of unconsciousness. So this traumatic brain injury is often described as a tragedy, but it profoundly shaped Tubman's inner life. So she reported experiencing powerful visions and religious experiences after this injury, believing God communicated with her directly. And a lot of historians and neurologists, they now recognize that her symptoms align with the temporal lobe epilepsy and the trauma-induced narcolepsy. But Tubman interpreted these episodes as divine guidance. And this is crucial because her physical injury became a spiritual compass because it forged her in an unshakable belief that she was being guided for a purpose. And also around 1844, she married John Tubman, who was a free black man. And this is a detail I think that many overlooked because her husband was free, yet she was still enslaved. Because under American law at the time, a person's status followed the mother, not the father or the spouse. So marriage did not grant them freedom. So this legal reality reveals the cold mechanics of slavery that love did not matter, marriage did not matter, legal status overrode the human relationship. Even more telling, when Harriet later decided to escape, John refused to go with her, and he was comfortable in his life, and he did not want to risk it. Eventually, the remarried, so eventually he remarried after she had fled away. And this moment is psychologically important because she learned that not everyone is willing to pursue freedom, even when it is possible. And by the time that Tubman had reached her mid 20s, before she ever escaped, the following had already shaped her: a fractured family from slave sales, survival skills from harsh environmental labor, a life altering head injury that gave her spiritual certainty, a marriage that taught her that freedom cannot be forced on others, and a deep attachment to her mother's legacy and identity. So she had already developed physical endurance, environmental mastery, spiritual conviction, emotional resilience, and a philosophy of collective freedom, all before she ever ran. And we also have the escape from slavery. So by 1849, Tubman's enslaver, a man by the name of Edward Brodus, had died, and his death created instability on the plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, because the enslaved people were considered financial assets, and debts often meant liquidation. And the rumors began circulating that Harriet and her brothers would be sold. For enslaved people, being sold south, it meant something very specific: permanent separation from family and transportation into the Deep South plantation system, where the conditions were notoriously harsher and the survival rates were lower. So this was not a vague fear. This was a common documented practice in the domestic slave trade. And Harriet understood that. She understood the implications immediately. Because once again, she already suffered a traumatic head injury from overseer's iron weight that caused lifelong seizures and visions, and the brutality of field labor, the emotional trauma of watching families being torn apart, and a forced marriage to John Tubman, who was a free black man who did not share her desire to flee. And when the rumors of sale had intensified, Tubman recognized a critical truth: that if she waited, then her life would no longer be her own to decide. And when she fled in late 1849, the term Underground Railroad was not yet a romanticized legend at this time, because it was a loose, dangerous, decentralized network of abolitionists, free black communities. You had Quakers, coded signals, and forest paths, rivers, and night travel. So Tubman, she likely traveled at night using the North Star for navigation and knowledge of terrain that was learned from the years of labor outdoors, and the swamps and the wooded areas to avoid patrols, and the help from sympathetic individuals who risked prison or fines. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 meant that she could be legally captured and returned at any point, even in free states. And slave catchers, they operated across the state lines, and the posters offered rewards for fugitives. On patrols, they searched the roads and they searched the waterways. And her journey from Maryland to Pennsylvania covered roughly 90 miles, mostly on foot, because at this time she had no map, she had no weapon, no guaranteed shelter, no certainty of who to trust, no food security, and a neurological condition that could render her unconscious without warning. And yet, she moved. And the most emotionally complex part of Tubman's escape is not the journey itself, but it's what she carried with her afterward. Because she left behind her husband, John Tubman. She left behind her parents, Ben and Rit Ross. She left behind her brothers, her extended enslaved community. So she did not leave because she wanted to leave. She left because escape in groups had increased the risk of capture. And many enslaved people were caught precisely because someone had panicked, made noise, or they turned back. So she understood something painful and strategic: that one person escaping successfully could return for others, and a group failing would doom everyone. So she made a decision that would haunt and motivate her. She would reach freedom first, and then she would come back. And this is where Harriet Tubman stops becoming a fugitive and now begins becoming a liberator. And now most people who escaped slavery, they never went back. And the risk, it was too high. Freedom was too fragile. So Tubman, she did the opposite. Her freedom, it felt incomplete because the people that she loved were still in chains. And that psychological state, freedom mixed with guilt, grief, and responsibility, it became the fuel for the rest of her life's mission. And then also her Harriet Tubman as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, when Harriet Tubman escaped slavery in 1849, she did not interpret her freedom as an endpoint. She interpreted it as a call to return, because most freedom seekers, they ran once and never looked back. But she did the opposite. So she made the radical decision to go back into the very system designed to kill her. And between approximately 1850 and 1860, Tubman made around 13 documented return missions into Maryland's eastern shore, slaveholding territory that knew her face, her history, and the value that was placed on her capture. And these were not symbolic trips. These were calculated covert operations into hostile land, where capture meant torture, sail deeper south, or execution. And this is what separates her from many others in abolitionist history, because she didn't just resist slavery, she operated inside it as a counterforce. And each return trip had required extraordinary planning, because she had to re enter the plantation regions without being recognized. She had to make contact with enslaved people secretly, and she had to coordinate timing, secrecy, and escape routes. And she had to move people who were terrified, untrained in stealth, and often physically exhausted. And she had to do all of this while the slave patrols, the bounty hunters, and the informants were actively searching for her. And Tubman, she didn't wander into Maryland hoping for success. She entered with intelligence, planning, and timing. So because see, she often traveled during the winter months when the nights were longer, people stayed indoors, tracking footprints was harder in frozen ground, and the movement had raised less suspicion. So she preferred to move groups on Saturday nights because slave patrols were less active on Sundays. And this was not accidental bravery. This was strategic intelligence work. And also, popular history once claimed that Tubman that she freed over 300 enslaved people. And modern historical scholarship, using documentation and testimonies, now estimates that she personally led around 70 people to freedom, and that she also provided instructions and guidance that helped dozens more escape independently. So while the number is lower than the folklore suggests, it makes her achievements more impressive, not less. And the reason why is because every single rescue, it required multiple days of covert movement, feeding, hiding, and protecting a group, passing through a chain of safe houses, and also evading people actively hunting them. So 70 people under these conditions is not a number. It is a series of successful military grade operations. And she also became effective, so effective that the slaveholders, they placed large bounties on her capture or death, collectively reported as high as $40,000, which was an enormous sum at that time, equivalent to the hundreds of thousands that are now today. And this tells us something very important, that the slaveholders, they did not see her as an escaped slave. They saw her as a strategic threat to the institution itself, and that her existence, it proved three dangerous ideas: that enslaved people could organize, that enslaved people could outthink the slave systems, and that enslaved people could come back and take others. And this is why she earned the name Moses of her people. Not just because she led people out, but because she kept returning to Egypt. And Tubman's survival also depended on the deep environmental knowledge and the coded communication. Because what she did was she used rivers as guides, moving along the water to avoid leaving tracks. And once again, she used the North Star for direction, the swamps and the forest as cover, and the rural back roads unknown to patrols. So she didn't travel like a fugitive. She traveled like somebody who understood the land better than those that were hunting her. And it was also coded communication through a song. Now, Tubman, she used spirituals and she used work songs as signals. So certain lyrics meant it was safe to move. others meant danger. So songs allowed communication without raising suspicion. And what sounded like faith was actually encrypted messaging. And then you also had the nighttime movement because she moved almost exclusively at night. And the groups, they hid during the day in barns, in root cellars, attics, forest cover. And if someone in the group, if somebody wanted to turn back, then she reportedly carried a firearm and made it clear that turning back endangered everyone. So this was not cruelty. Now see, this was not cruelty. This was the brutal math of survival. That one fearful person could expose the entire operation. And then before 1850, reaching a northern free state often meant safety. So after the Fugitive Slave Act, even northern states, even they were legally required to return escaped enslaved people. And this changed Tubman's routes permanently because now she had to guide people hundreds of miles further across the U.S. and the Canadian, it's pretty much across the U.S. into the Canadian border, and pretty much into unfamiliar territory. And this increased the travel time, the risk of exposure, and the physical strain on those escaping. But Tubman, she adopted, or she adapted to this because she didn't stop. She adjusted the mission. And the reason why this period of her life is very important is because this decade it shows Tubman not simply as a freedom seeker, but it shows her as a strategist, a tactician, an intelligence operative, a leader under pressure, a symbol of organized resistance. See, she was functioning in a role that was very similar to what we would call now special operations agent conducting extraction missions behind enemy lines. Except she had no funding. She had no backup. She had no weapons cache. She had no formal training, and she had no legal protection. The only things that she had were only resolve, faith, memory, and strategy. And we also have the activism. So, activism before and during the Civil War. Now, before the war ever began, Tubman already had built relationships with key abolitionist figures that would later make her invaluable to the Union. So she wasn't operating alone. See, she was part of an abolitionist intelligence network that included Frederick Douglass, who admired her courage deeply and once wrote that while he spoke against slavery, she acted against it. And then you also have Thomas Garrett, who was a Delaware Quaker who helped hundreds escape and financially supported Tubman's missions. And then you also had Martha Coffin Wright, who was a women's rights activist and Underground Railroad operative who helped coordinate the safe houses. So these were not casual friendships. These were operational relationships that were built on trust, secrecy, logistics, and strategy. So Tubman, she learned how to move people without detection. She knew how to read the terrain, use coded communication, identified who could be trusted, planning escape routes with military-like precision. And these were the exact same skills that the Union Army would later need. And also her role in the Civil War, and why the Union needed her. Now, when the Civil War began in 1861, the Union Army had a massive problem at this time in the South. The problem that they had was this. The problem was they didn't know the land. So you see, Confederate territory was the swamps, you had rivers, you had backwoods paths, plantation layouts, and hidden supply routes. But Harriet, she knew that these environments better than most generals. So she volunteered her services and went to South Carolina, where the large populations of enslaved people lived along the coastal plantations. So she began working in the Union camps as a nurse and caregiver. So Tubman, she used herbal remedies and traditional medicine that she learned in slavery to treat dysentery, smallpox, wounded soldiers, and malnourished formerly enslaved people that were fleeing plantations. So she wasn't just nursing soldiers, she was stabilizing refugee populations that followed Union troops. And she also played important roles as a scout and a spy. Now this was her greatest contribution. And this is where she becomes historically extraordinary. Because the Union generals, they realized something that enslaved people in the South, they knew the river routes, they knew the plantation layouts, they knew the Confederate movements, they knew the hidden supply caches, they knew the mine placements in the rivers. So Tubman organized a network of local black informants. She moved through Confederate territory quietly, often at night, gathering locations of torpedoes, which were water mines in the rivers, where the Confederate troops were stationed, which plantations held the largest slave populations, and which roads were safe for the Union travel. So she reported this back to the Union officers. And this is formal military intelligence work. And she was doing all this without pay for much of the war and also making military history. So this is the event. So the Combahee River Raid. Now, this event that places this is the event that places Tubman in military history books. Now, working with Colonel James Montgomery, Tubman helped plan a raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. And the goal here was to destroy the Confederate supply lines, to burn the plantations supporting the war effort, and to free enslaved people, and to cripple the Southern economy in that region. Now, Tubman, she guided the Union gunboats through the river around hidden torpedoes. So, because she had mapped the locations through her spy network, so when the Union boats had arrived, she led the operation on the ground, calling enslaved people to board the ships. And over 700 enslaved men, women, and children were freed in a single night. The plantations were burned, the Confederate resources were destroyed, and the labor forces were eliminated. Now, this was not symbolic. This was a strategic, economic, and military blow. So Harriet Tubman, she became the first woman in the United States history to plan and lead an armed military raid. And it's also important to talk about her military intelligence as well too, and why a lot of generals had listened to her. Now, the Union officers, they trusted Tubman because her information was always accurate, because she understood the geography better than military maps, and that she could predict the Confederate movement based on plantation patterns, and she understood the Southern psychology and the routines. So her reports, it helped avoid ambushes, to plan river movements, to time their raids, and to protect the Union soldiers. So she was operating at the level of a field intelligence officer without the title. And also, the reason why this part of Tubman's life is so important is because, once again, it proves that she was not only a liberator, an abolitionist, and a humanitarian, but she was also a tactician. She was a strategist. She was a spy. She was a military leader. And the skills that she developed escaping slavery became tools that she used to fight slavery at a national level. So she turned survival skills into warfare skills. And then we also have the post Civil War life and the activism. So when people think of Harriet Tubman, they think of the Underground Railroad, the pistol, the coded songs, the night missions, and the Combahee River Raid. But what often gets overlooked is that after the Civil War ended, Tubman did not retire in peace, nor did she live comfortably as a celebrated American hero. No, instead, her post war life reveals something even more profound, that she did not know how to stop serving people. So, freedom for her was never personal, it was always communal, because her later years in Auburn, New York, showed that the same woman who risked her life leading enslaved people to freedom and now turned her attention to the elderly, the poor, women's rights, and long term care for Black Americans who had been forgotten after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this period of her life is not about escape, it is about the sustained responsibility. So after the war, Tubman settled permanently in Auburn, New York, on the land that was purchased for her years earlier by Senator William H. Seward, who was a staunch abolitionist and a future Secretary of State. So Auburn became her home. It became a refuge for others and a community care site and a base of operations for activism. Now she lived on a modest farm, but this was not a but see this was not a peaceful retirement property. See, she used the farm to house elderly Black people with nowhere to go, and to care for sick friends, and taking in orphans, providing food, providing shelter for the destitute. And this was the decades. So this was this was decades before you had social services, before you had the elder care programs, or even public assistance that existed for Black Americans. So really, she became essentially a one woman social welfare system. And also in 1869, now in 1869, she also married Nelson Davis, who was a former Union soldier who was more than 20 years younger than her. And this marriage is historically important for two reasons: because she allowed herself personal companionship after a life of warfare and resistance. And it didn't slow her activism, it expanded it. And the couple, they later adopted a baby girl named Gertie. And Tubman, who had delivered hundreds of freedom, now became a mother in a traditional sense late in life. But even this was tied to service, because her home remained a refuge for others. And Gertie, her adopted daughter, grew up in a house where strangers were fed, they were clothed, and they were cared for daily. So this was not a private household. No, this was a humanitarian outpost. That's what it was. And also, Harriet Tubman also had a home for the aged and the indigent colored people in 1896. And this is one of the most overlooked achievements of Tubman's life, because in 1896, she purchased additional land next to her home and formally established the Harriet Tubman Home for aged and indigent colored people. And this was an now this is now see this was an early form of assisted living, elder care, hospice care, community housing, social support system for Black elders. And once again, at a time in when the Black Americans, they were excluded from most institutions, no elder care systems existed for them, for formerly enslaved people, and the poverty among the aged Black citizens, it was extreme. So Tubman, she built an institution from nothing because she raised money. She raised money by speaking engagements, donations from abolitionist allies, her own limited funds, and the church networks. And eventually, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, it actually took over management of the home. And this is very critical because Tubman, she didn't just care for people personally. She created a sustainable institution to care for them after she was gone. And that is systems thinking right there. That is a systems thinking. And on top of that, because even though she was illiterate, now this is where we get into Tubman's part in women's suffrage. Because at this time, even though she was illiterate, she became a powerful speaker in the women's suffrage movement because she worked alongside Susan B. Anthony. She also worked by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and even other suffrage leaders because she spoke from lived authority, not academic theory. And she would tell audiences that I suffered enough to believe in the rights of women. So her presence in the movement, it symbolized something very profound, that she had fought for racial freedom and now she fought for gender freedom. And her activism, it did not narrow with age. No, what it did was it expanded because she understood that liberation was incomplete if women were still denied political voice. And we also get to the point where the head injury. So remember the head injury that I talked about earlier? Now the head injury that she suffered as a teenager when an overseer threw a metal weight at her head, weight at her, it never healed. So for decades, so once again, she experienced seizures, narcoleptic episodes, severe headaches, blackouts, visions, and dreamlike states. So later in life, she underwent brain surgery without anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital in an attempt to relieve the symptoms. And this is astonishing because a woman in her 70s or her 80s, already physically worn down by decades of labor and stress, agreed to experimental brain surgery while they were still awake. But her health continued to decline, though. So by 1911, she moved into the very home that she founded for the aged, and she became one of her own residents. And this is historically poetic and tragic at the same time. So Harriet Tubman, she died on March 10th in 1913 in the Tubman home that she created. So she was surrounded by the people that she had helped. And her last words, reportedly, were, I go to prepare a place for you. So even in death, her mindset was still about preparing a place for others. And also her post war years, it also proves something that most history books miss, that Harriet Tubman was not only a freedom fighter, but she was a lifelong social architect because she moved from because before the war she was rescuing people from slavery, secret missions, night travel, individual liberation, and she didn't stop fighting. She simply changed the battlefields. And then after the war, she was rescuing people from abandonment, and then focusing on the public institutions, community building, and systemic care. So the death and commemoration of Harriet Tubman. So by the time that Harriet Tubman entered her final years in Auburn, New York, she was living in a state of physical exhaustion that had been building since childhood. So now once again, that head injury that she suffered, you know, it never healed. And once again, the chronic migraines, the sudden sleep episodes, the seizures and the visions, and the debilitating pain. So these were not minor inconveniences. No, these were lifelong neurological injuries that were sustained under slavery that she carried through the dozens of rescue missions on the Underground Railroad, spying and scouting missions for the Union Army, and leading the Combahee River Raid and the post-war humanitarian civil rights work. And by the early 1900s, her body was failing, and she had given nearly every ounce of strength to the fight for freedom, equality, and human dignity. So in 1908, she moved into the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a property that she had donated for the elderly black people who had nowhere else to go. And she eventually became a resident there herself once again. Now, and once again, this is deeply symbolic because a woman who freed hundreds ended her life in a home that she built so that others would not be abandoned. And once again, she died of pneumonia on March 10th, 1913, at approximately 91 years of age. So there was no national day of mourning. There was no presidential recognition. There was no state funeral. She died quietly in Auburn, New York, the same way that many black heroes of the 19th century had passed, respected by her community, but not yet fully honored by the country. And her reported final words were, once again, I go to prepare a place for you. And a biblical reference, a spiritual closing from a woman whose life had been guided by faith, visions, and a sense of divine mission. So Harriet Tubman was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery. And this is important because she was one of the very few black women in American history to receive military burial recognition at that time. And it was an acknowledgement, at least by the veterans and local citizens, that Tubman's Civil War service as a scout, a spy, a nurse, and raid leader was legitimate military contribution. So a gravestone does not simply mark her name. It recognizes her Underground Railroad work, her Civil War service, and her humanitarian legacy. So even in burial, her life is framed as service. So Harriet Tubman did not become a widely celebrated American icon immediately after her death. No. See, a recognition, it grew in phases because in the early 20th century, primarily remembered within the black communities, the abolitionist circles, and women's suffrage advocates. And then the mid 20th century, which was the civil rights era, she became a powerful symbol of black resistance, moral courage, and direct action against injustice. And then the late 20th and the 21st century, her legacy expanded into the mainstream American historical recognition, and now her name appears in school curriculums nationwide, historical landmarks, museums, national parks, and federal commemorations. So this delayed recognition, it reveals a key truth. America took nearly 100 years to fully admit how important Harriet Tubman was. And her life is preserved and honored through the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park in Maryland, and the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York, and the Harriet Tubman Museum in New Jersey. So numerous schools, libraries, and institutions bearing her name. And also you had Harriet Tubman Day, which is on March 10th. Because in 1990, the US Congress, they actually established Harriet Tubman Day, and they observed every March 10th, the anniversary of her death. And this date turning, into a day of national remembrance is very symbolic because the day that she died became the day that the nation formally remembers how she lived. And also, there was also a $20 bill, a symbolism of national recognition, because there were plans to place Harriet Tubman on the U.S. $20 bill are among the most profound symbolic recognitions in American history. So consider what this means. She was once legally considered property worth money, and she will now be the face of American currency. And that transformation is poetic justice at a historical level, because it's a statement that the woman who escaped slavery and fought it relentlessly is now recognized as a foundational American figure. So even though the bill redesign has faced delays, but the decision itself, it does mark a shift in how the country understands who its true heroes are. And also we have the historical impact and interpretation. So looking at Harriet Tubman as an abolitionist symbol, Tubman remains one of the most significant figures in the fight against slavery in the United States, embodying courage, strategic skill, and selfless leadership. And then the Underground Railroad narrative, because she helped shape the story of the Underground Railroad, a vital clandestine network that assisted many enslaved people to escape freedom and to escape to freedom, and struck symbolic blows against the institution of slavery. And then as a military pioneer, her Civil War work, it expanded her role from a rescuer to an active participant in military strategy and humanitarian support for the Union, illustrating how formerly enslaved people influenced national conflict and policy. And as a humanitarian and advocate, because beyond liberation, Tubman's later life demonstrated a sustained commitment to marginalized communities, the elderly, the formerly enslaved, women, and the poor, reaffirming her lifelong dedication to human rights. Harriet Tubman's life story is one of extraordinary resilience and devotion to freedom. From escaping slavery herself to risking her life to risking her life for others dozens of times, conducting strategic military actions, and advocating for justice until her final years, Tubman's legacy is deeply rooted in the struggle for human dignity and equality. Every stage of her life, marked by hardship, bravery, strategic thinking, and persistent humanitarianism, reflects her unique and powerful impact on American history.